One Untouchable Stallion, trainers, handlers, security. Each one paid to bring order. Each one backed away when the beast exploded into raw, dangerous panic. Commands cracked through the air, radios screamed for tranquilizers, and pride turned to dread under the Mafia Boss's silent stare from above. No one dared admit the truth. The animal wasn't wild. It was broken, and nobody could reach it. Then the maid stepped forward. She didn't shout. She didn't run. She simply raised her hand, and the entire yard went still. The morning air hung thick and oppressive over the Napa Valley estate, carrying with it the scent of sage and something darker, the metallic tang of fear that seemed to seep from the very soil. From the stone terrace of his sprawling ranch house, Gideon Hart stood motionless, his steel-grey eyes fixed on the chaos unfolding in the main paddock below. The silence around him wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of quiet that precedes an explosion. Obsidian reared again, his midnight coat gleaming with sweat as he struck out at the air with deadly precision. The stallion was magnificent and terrifying, a living storm contained only by reinforced steel fencing that groaned under the assault of his hooves. Another trainer stumbled backward, his face pale as he clutched a torn sleeve, joining the growing collection of injured men being discreetly escorted away from the paddock. 47 specialists, Logan Pierce murmured, appearing at Gideon's shoulder with the quiet efficiency that made him invaluable. The head of security's weathered face remained impassive, but his knuckles were white where they gripped his tablet. 47 failures. The animal is untouchable. Gideon's jaw tightened imperceptibly. The horse had been a gift, if one could call it that, from the Caldwell family, a political gesture wrapped in venomous silk, delivered with smiles that never reached their eyes. The stallion had nearly killed one of their own heirs before being transferred here, and now he was Gideon's problem. A living bomb with a ribbon tied around its neck. Below, another handler approached the paddock with a tranquilizer gun, moving with the careful precision of a man who understood that one misstep could mean broken bones or worse. Obsidian's nostrils flared, and his ears pinned back against his skull. The animal's intelligence was unmistakable. He knew exactly what was coming. "Sir," one of the ranch hands called up from the paddock, his voice carrying the strain of a long morning. "Dr. Martinez thinks we should—" He never finished the sentence. Obsidian launched himself at the fence with such violence that the entire structure shuddered, sending several men scrambling backward. The stallion's scream of rage echoed across the valley, a sound that seemed to come from something wilder and more primal than any domestic animal should possess. Gideon watched it all with the calculating detachment that had built his empire. Everything in his world could be controlled, contained, or eliminated. Everything except, apparently, this horse. A movement at the side gate caught his attention. A figure approached with measured steps, neither hurried nor hesitant. Riley Morgan, the house staff member whose presence was so consistent it had become invisible. She moved with purpose, her dark hair pulled back severely, her uniform pressed and proper. But something in her posture was different today, less deferential, more certain. She reached the paddock and stopped, her hands resting lightly on the top rail of the fence. The trained handlers continued their frantic preparations, but Riley simply stood there, watching. Obsidian noticed her immediately, his wild pacing slowing as his attention fixed on this new presence. For a heartbeat, the entire scene held its breath. Then Riley stepped forward, lifting one hand in a simple, open gesture. Not commanding, not demanding. Offering. The silence that followed was so profound that even the morning breeze seemed to pause in respect. Gideon leaned forward slightly, his fingers gripping the stone balustrade. Something in the quality of that silence told him that everything he thought he understood about power was about to change. Hi there, viewer. Thanks for being here. Drop a like and tell us in the comments what you thought of the story and what city you're watching from. Let's continue. The scent of leather and old money permeated every corner of the Hart estate, mingling with the earthy richness of turned soil and the distant perfume of grapevines that stretched across rolling hills like green fingers reaching toward the horizon. This was a world built on unspoken rules, where power moved in whispers and glances, where the wrong word or gesture could shift destinies without a single raised voice. Riley had learned these rules the hard way during her 18 months on the estate. Don't look directly at Mr. Hart unless spoken to. Don't speak unless absolutely necessary. Don't draw attention to yourself. Ever. The staff moved through the sprawling ranch house like ghosts, their footsteps muffled by Persian rugs worth more than most people's annual salaries, their conversations reduced to essential nods and hand signals. The main house sprawled across the hilltop like a sleeping giant, all stone and timber and glass that caught the California sun and threw it back in golden fragments. Inside, the air was always perfectly climate-controlled, carrying hints of expensive cologne, fresh flowers replaced daily, and something else, something harder to name but impossible to ignore. The scent of control itself, perhaps, of decisions that echoed far beyond these walls. Mrs. Delaney, the head housekeeper, had explained it to Riley on her first day with the kind of maternal firmness that brooked no argument. This house has rhythm, dear. Breakfast at 7 sharp, never a minute late. Mr. Hart takes his coffee black, his newspaper ironed, his privacy absolute. The horses get fed at dawn and dusk. The wine cellar stays locked except for Logan's weekly inventory. And most importantly, she had paused here, fixing Riley with steel-grey eyes that had seen decades of estate life. We are invisible. We do our work, we do it perfectly, and we disappear. Riley moved through that world now with practiced efficiency, her soft-soled shoes silent against hardwood floors that gleamed like dark water. The morning light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows painted everything in shades of amber and shadow. She could hear the distant sound of horses in the lower paddocks, the rhythmic thunk of an axe splitting wood somewhere near the stables, the low murmur of men's voices discussing things that weren't her business to understand. But as she dusted the mantelpiece in Gideon's study, her eyes inevitably drifted to the wall of photographs, images of horses mostly, championship bloodlines, prize winners, creatures of such refined breeding they seemed to exist in a different category from ordinary animals. Yet none of them looked like obsidian. None carried that wild energy, that sense of barely contained storm. Through the study's massive windows she could see the main paddock, where the morning's drama had unfolded. The damaged fence had already been repaired with military efficiency, the blood-stained sawdust replaced, the evidence of chaos erased as if it had never happened. Only the lingering tension in the air suggested that something significant had occurred. Riley's hands stilled on the silver frame she'd been polishing. The photograph inside showed a younger Gideon standing beside a chestnut mare, his expression softer somehow, less armored. Behind him, barely visible in the background, stood a woman with dark hair and laughing eyes. The woman's face was partially obscured by shadow, but something about her stance, her way of holding herself, seemed familiar in a way that made Riley's chest tighten. "The Delaney rules don't apply to you anymore." The voice came from directly behind her, low and controlled. Riley spun around, her heart hammering against her ribs. Gideon stood in the doorway, his presence filling the space in a way that made the expansive study feel suddenly cramped. He moved into the room with predatory grace, each step deliberate and measured. "Sir?" Riley's voice came out smaller than she'd intended. He gestured toward the window, toward the paddock where Obsidian now stood quietly in the afternoon sun. 47 specialists couldn't do what you did with a lifted hand. That changes things. Riley set down the frame with careful precision, her mind racing through the implications of those words. In 18 months of invisible service, she'd never been alone in a room with Gideon Hart, never been the direct focus of his attention. The weight of his gaze felt like standing too close to an electrical storm. She began, but he cut her off with a slight raise of his hand. "Don't explain it away," he said, moving to stand behind his desk, the massive piece of furniture serving as a barrier between them. "I want to understand what happened out there, and I want to understand why my horse responds to you when he won't let anyone else within 10 feet. The afternoon light streaming through the windows cast sharp angles across his face, highlighting the precise cut of his jaw, the calculating intelligence in his eyes. This was a man accustomed to having answers, to understanding every variable in his carefully constructed world. Riley felt the invisible rules that had governed her life on the estate shifting beneath her feet like unstable ground. She was no longer part of the background, no longer safely anonymous. Whatever had happened at the paddock had pulled her into the harsh light of Gideon Hart's direct attention, and something in the way he watched her, patient but relentless, told her there would be no going back to the shadows. 3 days passed before Gideon summoned her again. 3 days during which Riley felt the weight of changed circumstances in every interaction, every sideways glance from the other staff members. Mrs. Delaney's disapproval was palpable, a cold draft that followed Riley through the corridors. The other housekeepers whispered in corners, their voices cutting off when she approached. Logan Pierce appeared at her shoulder Tuesday morning as she arranged fresh flowers in the main foyer. "Mr. Hart wants to see you," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "The East Stable. Now." The walk across the estate grounds felt endless. Morning mist clung to the valley floor, softening the edges of distant hills, but doing nothing to ease the knot of tension growing in Riley's chest. The East Stable was smaller than the main complex, more intimate, a place where serious conversations happened away from prying eyes. She found Gideon standing beside a gleaming chestnut mare, his hands moving with surprising gentleness as he checked her legs. The contrast struck her immediately. This man who commanded empires with ruthless precision, showing such careful attention to a horse's comfort. "Serafina," he said without looking up. 3-year-old thoroughbred, promising bloodline, but she's developed a fear response to the mounting block. Won't let anyone approach from the left side. He straightened, finally meeting Riley's eyes. "My trainer thinks she's ruined. Recommends retirement to pasture." Riley studied the mare, noting the way her ears swiveled nervously, how she kept her weight shifted slightly away from her left side. What happened to her? Kicked by another horse during training. Physical injury healed months ago. Gideon moved to lean against the stable wall, his posture deceptively casual. But the fear remains. The morning air carried scents of hay and leather, the distant sound of other horses moving in their stalls. Riley could feel Gideon's attention like heat against her skin, patient but predatory. "I have a proposition," he continued. "A test, if you will. I want to see if your gift extends beyond traumatized stallions." Riley's breath caught. "Sir, I'm not—" "You have 1 hour." His voice cut through her protest with surgical precision. "Get Serafina to accept the mounting block from the left side. Do that, and we'll discuss your future here. Fail, and you return to invisibility permanently." The silence that followed felt loaded with implications she couldn't fully grasp. This wasn't just about the horse. It was about something larger, more complex. A game whose rules she didn't understand, but whose stakes felt suddenly enormous. "Why?" she asked, the word escaping before she could stop it. Gideon's smile was sharp as winter sunlight. "Because I don't believe in accidents. Your success with Obsidian was either blind luck or genuine skill. I prefer to deal in certainties." He gestured toward a corner of the stable where a mounting block sat, its wooden surface worn smooth by years of use. "The tools are there. The horse is here. The clock—" He glanced at his watch with theatrical precision. "Starts now." Riley felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with being cornered, but underneath it was something else, a spark of defiance she'd learned to bury during her months of careful invisibility. She moved towards Serafina, her steps measured and deliberate. The mare's nostrils flared as Riley approached, her body language screaming wariness. But Riley had grown up around horses that carried their own traumas, animals that had learned to associate human hands with pain or neglect. She knew the language of broken trust. "Easy, girl," she murmured, her voice soft as silk over steel. From the corner of her eye she could see Gideon watching with the focused intensity of a predator studying prey. This wasn't just a test of her abilities, it was an evaluation, a judgment that would determine her place in his carefully ordered world. The mounting block seemed to loom larger than its modest size should allow, casting shadows that spoke of challenge and consequence. Riley took a breath, centering herself the way her grandmother had taught her years ago, and began the delicate dance of earning a frightened horse's trust. The hour stretched ahead, like a tightrope suspended over an abyss. Riley approached Serafina with movements that seemed choreographed by instinct rather than training. Each step was deliberate, her body language speaking a language older than words. the universal dialect of respect between prey animals and those who understood their world. She kept her shoulders soft, her breathing steady, her eyes focused not on the mare's head, but on a point just beyond her left shoulder. "Easy, beautiful," she whispered, her voice carrying undertones that seemed to resonate in the stable's wooden bones. "Nobody's going to hurt you today." Gideon remained motionless against the wall, but Riley could feel his attention like a physical weight. This wasn't casual observation, this was assessment, the kind of scrutiny that peeled back layers to expose whatever lay beneath careful facades. Seraphina's ears flicked forward at the sound of Riley's voice, then back again in nervous indecision. The mare had been conditioned by months of well-meaning handlers who approached her trauma with textbook solutions and professional distance. But Riley moved with something different, a quality that spoke of shared understanding rather than clinical detachment. When she reached the mare's side, Riley placed her palm flat against the warm neck, feeling the rapid flutter of pulse beneath Silk's soft coat. "You remember, don't you?" she murmured. "That moment when everything changed, when safe became dangerous." The words seemed to surprise her even as she spoke them, as if they came from someplace deeper than conscious thought. Gideon's eyes narrowed slightly, the first crack in his predatory patience. Riley began to move in slow circles around Seraphina, each revolution bringing her incrementally closer to the feared left side. But instead of forcing the approach, she used the mare's natural curiosity, allowing Seraphina to choose each moment of contact. When the horse tensed, Riley backed off. When she relaxed, Riley rewarded the trust with gentle pressure from her palm. "Most people think it's about dominance," Riley said softly, though whether to the horse or to Gideon wasn't entirely clear. "But it's not. It's about giving them back the choice that was taken away." 20 minutes in, something shifted. Seraphina's breathing deepened, her weight settling more evenly across all 4 legs. Riley had worked her way to the left shoulder now, the territory that had been forbidden for months. The mare's eyes were soft, alert, but not panicked. "Where did you learn that?" Gideon's voice cut through the stable's quiet, like a blade through silk. Riley's hands stilled for a moment, the question catching her off guard. She'd been so focused on the mare that she'd forgotten the performance aspect of this exercise, forgotten that every word and gesture was being catalogued and analyzed. "Learn what, sir?" But even as she asked, she knew she'd revealed too much. The rhythm of her movements, the specific pressure of her touch, the way she read the horse's emotional state, none of it came from books or formal training. "That particular approach to trauma rehabilitation," he said, pushing off from the wall to move closer. "The circular pattern, the voice modulation, the way you're using her curiosity against her fear, it's not standard technique." Riley guided Seraphina toward the mounting block, her heart hammering against her ribs. The mare followed willingly, trusting now in a way that would have seemed impossible an hour ago. But Riley barely noticed the victory. All her attention was focused on the dangerous shift in Gideon's tone. "My grandmother," she said finally, the partial truth slipping out before she could stop it. "She had a way with difficult horses." When Seraphina stepped up beside the mounting block without hesitation, positioning herself to be mounted from the left side for the first time in months, Gideon's expression changed entirely. The boredom and casual assessment evaporated, replaced by something sharper, hungrier. "Interesting," he said, his voice carrying new weight. "And what other gifts did your grandmother pass down?" Riley's mouth went dry. The test was over, but the real examination was just beginning. The summons came at dawn. Not through Logan or Mrs. Delaney this time, but delivered personally by Gideon himself, who appeared at Riley's modest quarters behind the main house as morning mist still clung to the valley floor. She opened the door to find him standing there in riding clothes, his presence filling the narrow doorframe like contained lightning. "Get dressed," he said without preamble. "We're going for a ride." Riley's sleep-clouded mind struggled to process the command. In 18 months on the estate, she had never seen any staff member accompany Gideon on his private rides. Those morning excursions into the hills were sacred territory, moments when the master of the house shed his public armor and became something more elemental. "Sir, I don't think—" Serafina needs consistent handling to maintain her progress, he interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. You'll ride her. I'll take Thunder. His eyes glittered with something that might have been amusement. Unless you're going to tell me your grandmother forgot to teach you how to sit a horse. 20 minutes later, Riley found herself in the stable's tack room, surrounded by leather goods worth more than most people's cars. The scent of saddle soap and expensive oils filled her nostrils as she struggled with unfamiliar equipment. Every piece of tack here was custom-made, fitted to specific horses, with a precision that spoke of serious money and serious riding. Gideon appeared behind her, his movements silent on the stable's stone floor. Without asking permission, he reached around her to adjust the girth, his body close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive and understated that mixed with the earthier scents of horses and leather. Too tight, he murmured, his breath warm against her ear. You'll spook her before we leave the stable. His hands guided hers on the buckles, demonstrating the proper tension with a patience that seemed at odds with his usual decisive nature. The contact was brief but deliberate, and Riley felt her pulse quicken in response to the unexpected intimacy. Better, he said, stepping back. Mount up. The ride began in carefully maintained silence, two horses picking their way along trails that wound through Gideon's vast holdings. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying scents of wild sage and distant ocean salt. Serafina moved with newfound confidence beneath Riley, responsive to the lightest touch of rain or shift of weight, but Riley could feel Gideon's attention like heat against her back. This wasn't a casual ride, it was another test, more subtle than the stable challenge but potentially more dangerous. Out here, away from the safety of witnesses and established protocols, she was completely at his mercy. They rode for an hour before he spoke again. "Tell me about the ranch where you learned to ride," he said, his voice carrying easily across the space between their horses. The question hit like a physical blow. Riley's hands tightened reflexively on Serafina's reins, causing the mare to toss her head in protest. She forced herself to relax, but not before Gideon had noticed the reaction. "I grew up in Montana," she said carefully. "Small operation. Nothing like this." Montana. He tasted the word, as if testing its weight. "Long way from California. What brought you here?" The trail had narrowed now, forcing them to ride single file with Gideon taking the lead. Riley watched the easy way he sat his horse, the unconscious authority in his posture. Thunder was a magnificent black gelding, easily 16 hands and built for power, but under Gideon's guidance he moved with the precision of a dancer. "Work," she said simply, hoping brevity would discourage further questions. "Work?" His laugh held no humor. "That's not an answer, Riley, that's evasion." The sound of her name on his lips sent an unexpected shiver down her spine. In all their previous interactions, he had maintained careful distance. No names, no personal acknowledgement. But something had changed with yesterday's test, shifted them onto new and potentially treacherous ground. They crested a hill, and the valley spread below them like a green tapestry dotted with oak trees and vineyard rows. In the distance, the Pacific Ocean gleamed like hammered silver. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Gideon said, drawing Thunder to a halt. "I bought this land because of this view. Sometimes the things that call to us most strongly are the things that remind us of what we've lost." Riley felt the weight of hidden meaning in his words, but before she could respond, he turned Thunder back toward home, leaving her to follow and wonder what secrets lay buried in the careful architecture of his questions. The crisis arrived with the afternoon mail, delivered by a courier whose nervous energy infected the entire household within minutes. Riley was arranging fresh linens in the guest wing when she heard the commotion. Raised voices from Gideon's study, the sharp crack of a door slamming, Logan's measured footsteps moving with unusual urgency across the marble foyer. Mrs. Delaney appeared in the hallway, her usually composed face tight with worry. "Emergency staff meeting," she announced tersely. "Main dining room, now." Riley followed the other household members into the formal dining room, its mahogany table gleaming under crystal chandeliers that cast dancing shadows across worried faces. Gideon stood at the head of the table, a newspaper spread before him like evidence at a crime scene. Logan flanked him, his jaw set in grim lines that spoke of serious trouble. "Ladies and gentlemen," Gideon began, his voice carrying the controlled fury of a man accustomed to controlling narratives, "it appears we have a situation." He held up the newspaper, the San Francisco Chronicle's business section. Even from across the room, Riley could see the headline, "Hart Estate Under Investigation. Anonymous Sources Allege Financial Irregularities." The silence that followed was deafening. Riley felt the temperature in the room drop several degrees as the implications sank in. An investigation meant auditors, reporters, government officials crawling over every aspect of the estate's operations. It meant scrutiny of employment records, visa statuses, background checks for every person who worked within these walls. "The article is vague," Logan said, his voice carefully controlled, "but it mentions questionable labor practices and possible tax irregularities. Someone with access to internal information fed them details." Riley's stomach clenched. She thought of her employment paperwork, the careful lies woven through her background check, the identity she'd constructed to disappear into anonymity. Under serious investigation, those fabrications would crumble like tissue paper in rain. "All staff will undergo enhanced background verification," Gideon continued, his gaze sweeping across the assembled faces. "Those with any irregularities in their employment status should consider this fair warning." His eyes found Riley's across the room and held them for a heartbeat longer than necessary. The message was clear. Your secrets are about to become a liability. "Sir," Mrs. Delaney ventured, her voice steady despite the tension, "how do we proceed with daily operations?" "Carefully," Gideon replied. "No unnecessary visitors. All communications go through Logan, and anyone who speaks to reporters or investigators without explicit permission will find their employment terminated immediately." As the meeting dispersed, Riley felt the walls of her carefully constructed life closing in. She had maybe days before investigators arrived, before her false documentation was exposed, before questions were asked that she couldn't answer without unraveling everything. She was almost to the door when Gideon's voice stopped her cold. "Miss Morgan, a word." The dining room emptied quickly, leaving them alone among the shadows and gleaming silver. Gideon remained at the head of the table, but his posture had shifted. Less formal authority, more predatory focus. "Interesting timing," he said conversationally. "You demonstrate unusual skills with horses, catch my attention, and within days someone decides to shine a very bright light on my operations." Riley's mouth went dry. "Sir, I would never—" "Of course you wouldn't." His smile was sharp as a blade. "Because you understand that if investigators start digging into employee backgrounds, they might discover that Riley Morgan didn't exist before 18 months ago. They might wonder what happened to the woman who held that identity before you borrowed it." The words hit like physical blows. He knew. Somehow impossibly he had known all along. "They might also wonder," he continued, moving around the table with predatory grace, "why someone with your particular talents chose to hide among my household staff. What you might have been running from, what you might have been watching for." He stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could see the calculating intelligence in his eyes. "So here's what's going to happen. You're going to help me identify who leaked this information, and in return I'm going to protect you from whatever storm is coming." His voice dropped to a whisper. "Because, Riley, I suspect we both have secrets worth protecting." The investigation team arrived at dawn like a plague of locusts in expensive suits. Riley watched from the kitchen window as black sedans wound up the estate's private road, their tinted windows reflecting the morning sun like dead eyes. Federal agents, IRS auditors, Labor Department officials, enough bureaucratic firepower to dismantle a small corporation. "Pack light," Gideon had told her the night before, his voice carrying the weight of non-negotiable command. "One bag. You have 20 minutes." Now she stood in the estate's private garage, her hastily assembled belongings clutched in white-knuckled hands, watching as Logan supervised the loading of several black SUVs with military precision. The vehicles were armored. She could tell by the way they sat heavy on their suspension, the subtle thickness of the windows. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the rumble of engines. "Somewhere they can't follow," Gideon replied, emerging from the house with his own travel bag and a briefcase that looked like it could survive a nuclear blast. "At least not immediately." "Mrs." Delaney appeared at Riley's shoulder, pressing a thermos of coffee and a wrapped sandwich into her hands. "Take care of yourself, dear," the older woman murmured, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "And don't trust everything he tells you." Before Riley could ask what that meant, Logan was guiding her toward the lead SUV, his hand firm but gentle on her elbow. The interior smelled of leather and something else. Gun oil, she realized with a start. This wasn't just transportation, it was tactical movement. "Bulletproof?" she asked as the convoy pulled away from the estate. "Among other things," Gideon replied from the seat beside her, his attention focused on a tablet displaying what looked like news feeds. The Chronicle article was just the beginning. Someone orchestrated a coordinated media assault. 3 more newspapers ran variations of the story this morning. Riley watched the familiar landscape of the Napa Valley disappear behind them, replaced by increasingly urban sprawl as they headed south toward San Francisco. The realization hit her like cold water. She was completely dependent on Gideon now, cut off from any possibility of independent escape. "Why protect me?" she asked suddenly. "You could have just let the investigation expose me. Deal with one less complication." Gideon looked up from his tablet, his gray eyes unreadable in the SUV's dim interior. "Because complications can be useful if you understand how to leverage them. And because whoever is behind this attack knows about you." The words sent ice through her veins. "What do you mean?" "The newspaper article specifically mentioned questionable employee backgrounds and identity irregularities," he said, his voice flat with controlled anger. "Those aren't generic accusations. Someone fed them very specific information about you." Riley's mind raced through the implications. Her carefully constructed false identity hadn't just been discovered, it had been weaponized against Gideon. But how? And by whom? "They're using you as ammunition," Logan said from the front seat, his eyes meeting hers in the rearview mirror. "Which means you're safer with us than anywhere else, at least until we figure out who's pulling the strings." The convoy turned into an underground parking garage, the vehicles disappearing into shadows that felt like temporary sanctuary. As they emerged from the SUV, Riley found herself in what appeared to be a high-end residential building, all marble and brass, and the kind of understated luxury that whispered old money. "Safe house," Gideon explained, guiding her toward a private elevator. "Registered under a shell corporation that would take investigators months to trace, assuming they could even find it." The elevator rose silently to the top floor, opening onto a penthouse that commanded sweeping views of San Francisco Bay. The space was furnished like a luxury hotel suite, impersonal but comfortable, designed for temporary occupation by people who valued privacy over personality. "Welcome to your new reality," Gideon said, setting down his briefcase with surgical precision. "Until we identify our enemy and neutralize the threat, you're under my protection. That means you go nowhere without Logan's clearance, speak to no one without my permission, and trust no one except the people in this room." He moved to the floor-to-ceiling windows, his silhouette stark against the glittering bay. "Because whoever orchestrated this attack didn't just want to damage me, they wanted to flush you out of hiding. The question is why?" Riley stared at his reflection in the glass, understanding finally that she wasn't just a pawn in whatever game was being played. She was a target. The interrogation began over dinner. Not harsh spotlights and metal chairs, but expensive wine and perfectly prepared salmon served on china that probably cost more than Riley's monthly salary. Gideon had changed from his travel clothes into dark slacks and a white shirt, the casualness somehow more intimidating than his usual formal armor. "Tell me about Montana," he said, cutting into his fish with surgical precision. "What was the name of the ranch where you learned to work with traumatized horses?" Riley's fork paused halfway to her mouth. She'd prepared for this conversation, rehearsed the lies until they felt like memories. "Circle K Ranch, outside of Billings." "Interesting." Gideon's tone remained conversational, but she could feel the razor's edge beneath the silk. "Logan did some research while we were traveling. No record of a Circle K ranch in that area. Hasn't been for 15 years. The wine turned to acid in her mouth. She set down her glass with careful control, buying time while her mind raced through alternatives. It was small. Family operation. Maybe it wasn't registered properly. Maybe. His smile never reached his eyes. What was the family's name? Kellerman, she said, the lie slipping out smooth as water. It was a good lie, generic enough to be believable, specific enough to sound real. And this grandmother who taught you about horses, she was a Kellerman too. Riley nodded, not trusting her voice. The apartment's lighting cast warm shadows across Gideon's face, but his eyes remained cold as winter steel. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, San Francisco glittered like a circuit board, all lights and interconnected pathways that led nowhere she could escape to. "Show me your hands," he said suddenly. "What?" "Your hands. Palm up." Confusion warred with wariness as Riley extended her hands across the small table. Gideon leaned forward, his fingers tracing lines across her palms with surprising gentleness. His touch was warm, clinical, but something in the contact made her pulse quicken despite the danger. "Calluses here," he murmured, his thumb brushing across the base of her fingers. "From rains, but also here." He touched a spot near her wrist. "From tools, not ranch tools, something finer, more precise." Riley tried to pull her hands back, but his grip tightened just enough to hold her in place. "And these scars along your knuckles, they're not from horses, they're from wire. Thin wire worked with precision over long periods." Her breath caught. Those scars were old, faded, barely visible unless someone knew exactly what to look for. "I don't know what you mean." "You're an artist," he continued, his voice soft as silk over steel. "Or were. Sculptor maybe? Jewelry maker? Something that required fine motor control and endless patience." He released her hands finally, sitting back with predatory satisfaction. "The question is why someone with those skills chose to scrub floors in my house." The silence stretched between them like a tightrope. Riley could hear the distant hum of traffic, the whisper of expensive air conditioning, the thundering of her own heartbeat. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but there was nowhere to go. The apartment was 40 stories above street level. Logan was stationed outside the only exit, and even if she could somehow escape, the investigation had burned every bridge back to her old life. "People run from different things," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Money problems, bad relationships, family issues." "Or," Gideon said, refilling her wine glass with deliberate care, "they run from people who want to hurt them. People who might use their skills for purposes they can't live with." The observation hit like a physical blow. Riley's composure cracked just enough for him to see the flash of pain, quickly suppressed, but not quickly enough. His expression shifted subtly, less predatory, more calculating. "What did they want you to make, Riley?" His voice was gentler now, almost sympathetic. "What was so terrible that you'd rather disappear entirely than create it?" She stared into her wine, seeing her fractured reflection in the dark liquid. The truth sat in her throat like broken glass, too dangerous to swallow, too sharp to speak. But the weight of 18 months of careful lies was becoming unbearable. "I can protect you," he continued, his voice soft as a promise. "But only if you trust me with the truth." The offer hung in the air between them, seductive and terrifying in equal measure. The betrayal came from the last person either of them suspected. Riley woke to the sound of hushed voices in the apartment's main room, emergency tones that cut through sleep like cold steel. Dawn light filtered through the penthouse windows as she pulled on a robe and padded barefoot toward the commotion. Logan stood near the kitchen island, his usually composed face grim as he spoke in rapid, clipped sentences into his phone. Gideon paced behind him like a caged predator, his hair disheveled, still wearing yesterday's clothes as if he'd never gone to bed. "How long?" Gideon's voice carried the controlled fury that made grown men step carefully around him. "The leak went out 6 hours ago," Logan replied, ending his call with surgical precision. "Financial records, employee files, security protocols, everything." Riley's stomach dropped. "What leak?" Both men turned to look at her. and she saw something in their expressions that made the morning air feel suddenly arctic. Gideon moved to the wall of windows, his reflection ghost-like against the brightening sky. "Someone with access to my private servers uploaded terabytes of data to an encrypted site," he said, his voice flat with barely contained rage. "The same someone who's been feeding information to the investigators. The same someone who knew exactly when and how to flush you out of hiding." "But who has that kind of access?" Riley asked, though part of her already suspected the answer would be devastating. "That's what we just discovered," Logan said grimly. He activated a tablet and Mrs. Delaney's face appeared on the screen, a security camera image time-stamped from the previous night. The elderly housekeeper was in Gideon's private study, her fingers moving across his computer keyboard with practiced efficiency. Riley felt the world tilt on its axis. Mrs. Delaney, who had taught her the rules of invisibility, who had pressed coffee and sandwiches into her hands with maternal concern, who had whispered warnings about trusting Gideon too completely. 23 years, Gideon said, his voice hollow with something that might have been grief. 23 years she's been in my house, managing my household, earning my trust. He turned from the window, and Riley saw something she'd never expected in his eyes, genuine pain. The investigators didn't need to dig for information. It was handed to them on a silver platter. "Sir," Logan said carefully, "there's more." The data dump included everything about Miss Morgan's employment file, but also personal details. Things that weren't in any official records. Riley's blood turned to ice. What kind of personal details? Logan's expression was grim as he pulled up another screen. "Your real name, your previous address in Seattle, photos of your artwork, and contact information for someone named Marcus Caldwell." The name hit like a physical blow. Riley sank onto the nearest chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. Marcus Caldwell, the heir who'd been injured by obsidian, the young man who'd visited the ranch with such carefully concealed malice. "You know him," Gideon observed, his tone sharp with new understanding. "This isn't coincidence. The horse, your employment at my estate, the timing of everything, it's all connected." Riley's hands shook as the full scope of the trap became clear. "He's been looking for me," she whispered. "Ever since I disappeared. He hired investigators, used his family's connections, and when he couldn't find me, he set up this elaborate game to flush me out." "What does he want?" Gideon's voice was deadly quiet. Riley met his eyes, seeing her own fear reflected in the steel-grey depths. "He wants me to finish what I started, the commission I ran away from, the piece I couldn't complete because I finally understood what it was really for." She stood on unsteady legs, moving to the window where the morning sun cast long shadows across the city below. "Marcus Caldwell doesn't just collect art, he collects people. Talented people he can control, manipulate, use for purposes they don't understand until it's too late." "And you were one of his acquisitions," Gideon said, the pieces clicking into place. "Until I found out what he really wanted me to create," Riley replied, her voice barely audible. "What he planned to do with it. By the time I understood, I was already in too deep to simply walk away. So I ran instead." Logan's phone buzzed with an incoming message. He glanced at it and his face went pale. "Sir, we have a problem. Mrs. Delaney didn't act alone. The security footage shows she was receiving instructions through encrypted messages. The last one came in 20 minutes ago." He held up the screen, and Riley read the message with growing horror. "Phase 2 complete. Begin retrieval. Asset secured at known location." Gideon's expression shifted into something arctic and dangerous. "They know where we are." They had less than an hour before Caldwell's people would arrive. Riley could see it in the military precision of Logan's movements as he gathered equipment, the cold calculation in Gideon's eyes as he made rapid-fire phone calls to contacts whose names she suspected were better left unknown. "Safe house in Marin is compromised," Logan reported, his voice tight with controlled urgency. "They've been tracking our communications. Every backup location we have is potentially burned." Gideon ended another call with sharp frustration. "My usual resources are under federal surveillance. Everyone's too nervous to move until the investigation clears." He turned to Riley, his expression grim. "We're on our own." Riley moved to the penthouse's main computer terminal, her fingers already dancing across the keyboard with muscle memory that had nothing to do with her months of domestic invisibility. "Not necessarily," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Marcus made one crucial mistake. He thinks he knows what I can do, but he only knows what I let him see." The screen filled with cascading lines of code as Riley's true skills emerged like a butterfly shedding its chrysalis. This wasn't the careful, tentative typing of a housekeeper. This was the fluid confidence of someone who spoke in algorithms and thought in digital architecture. "You're a hacker," Gideon said, understanding dawning in his voice. "Systems architect," Riley corrected, her attention split between multiple windows opening simultaneously. The art was just camouflage, a way to get close to high-value targets without raising suspicion. Marcus thought he was commissioning sculptures, but what he really wanted was someone who could crack any security system ever built. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, navigating through layers of encrypted networks with the ease of someone who had helped design half of them. He wanted me to create a masterpiece, a system that could infiltrate any financial institution, any government database, any corporate network. Untraceable, undetectable, unstoppable. "And you refused," Logan said, watching the screens with growing amazement as Riley dismantled firewall after firewall. "I ran," she replied, accessing a server cluster that shouldn't have existed on any official network. "But I kept a few insurance policies, including administrative access to Marcus Caldwell's entire digital empire." The main screen shifted to show a real-time view of Caldwell's private communications network. Messages flowed like water, revealing the scope of his operation in devastating detail. Financial transactions, personnel movements, surveillance reports, everything. "He's got teams positioned at 6 different locations," Riley said, her voice tight with concentration. "They expected us to run to your usual safe houses, but there's something else." She paused, her face paling as she accessed deeper files. "He's planning to frame you for financial crimes that he's actually committing. The investigation isn't just harassment, it's a setup." Gideon leaned over her shoulder close enough that she could smell his cologne mixed with the sharp scent of adrenaline. "Can you stop it?" Riley's smile was sharp as broken glass. "I can do better than that. I can turn his own trap against him." Her fingers moved with surgical precision, executing commands that sent ripples through Caldwell's carefully constructed web of deception. Bank transfers reversed themselves, encrypted communications unlocked themselves, financial records restored themselves to their original, accurate states. "What are you doing?" Logan asked, watching numbers cascade across multiple screens. "Giving the investigators what they really need," Riley replied. "Evidence of the actual crimes. Marcus has been using shell companies to launder money through art purchases for years. The sculptures I was commissioned to create, they were never about the physical pieces. They were digital keys to unlock accounts he thought no one could trace." The computer chimed softly as the final transfers completed. $57 million in stolen assets returned to their rightful accounts. A network of corrupted officials exposed through their own communications. Evidence of conspiracy, fraud, and racketeering delivered directly to federal databases with unbreakable authentication. "It's done," Riley said, sitting back from the keyboard with exhausted satisfaction. "Marcus Caldwell is about to discover that his empire is built on sand, and the federal investigation just shifted targets." Gideon's phone rang almost immediately. His conversation was brief, his expression shifting from grim to predatory as he absorbed the information. "The FBI just raided Caldwell properties in 3 states, he reported. "The financial investigation has been officially redirected, and Mrs. Delaney was arrested 20 minutes ago trying to board a private flight to Monaco." Riley felt something shift inside her chest. Not relief, but something deeper. For 18 months, she'd been running from Marcus Caldwell's shadow. Now finally, she'd stepped into the light and faced it down. "So what happens now?" she asked. Gideon's smile was sharp with newfound respect. "Now we go home and discuss the terms of your real employment." The victory lasted exactly 48 hours before the real cost became clear. Riley stood in the ranch house's main foyer, watching federal agents carry boxes of evidence down the marble stairs, not targeting Gideon this time, but cleaning up the remnants of Mrs. Delaney's 23-year deception. The woman she'd trusted with maternal warmth had left behind a web of compromised security protocols, leaked personnel files, and surveillance equipment hidden in places no one had thought to check. "The wine cellar," Logan reported grimly, appearing with another tablet full of damning discoveries. She'd been recording every private conversation for months, audio equipment disguised as ventilation sensors. Gideon stood at the window, his reflection ghost-like against the afternoon light. The past 2 days had aged him in ways that had nothing to do with time. Learning that his most trusted employee had been systematically betraying him for nearly a quarter-century had shattered something fundamental in his carefully constructed world. "How much did she hear?" Riley asked, though she already suspected the answer would be devastating. "Everything," Logan replied. "Business negotiations, security briefings, personal conversations. She even recorded your sessions with Obsidian." The implications hit like physical blows. Every moment of vulnerability, every careful word, every strategy discussion, all of it had been transmitted to Marcus Caldwell like intelligence from a war zone. Riley felt exposed in a way that made her skin crawl, as if every private thought had been stripped bare and catalogued. "The staff is in chaos," Logan continued. "Half of them are requesting transfers. The others are too scared to speak above a whisper. They don't know who else might have been compromised." Riley moved through the house that had become familiar over 18 months, seeing it now with new eyes. Every corner could hide surveillance equipment. Every friendly face could mask deception. The trust that made household operations possible had been poisoned at its source. In the kitchen, she found the remaining staff clustered around the breakfast table like survivors of a shipwreck. Their conversations died when she entered, replaced by the kind of uncomfortable silence that spoke of secrets and suspicions. Maria, one of the younger housekeepers, wouldn't even meet her eyes. "They blame you," came a voice from behind her. Riley turned to find Thomas, the head groundskeeper, his weathered face grim with something that might have been sympathy. "Not really your fault, but you're the visible change. Everything was normal until you showed up and caught Mr. Hart's attention." The words stung because they carried truth. Riley's emergence from invisibility had indeed triggered the cascade of revelations that brought their comfortable world crashing down. The staff's carefully maintained anonymity, their protection and their prison, had been shattered by her refusal to stay hidden. "Maybe they're right," she said quietly. "Maybe," Thomas agreed with brutal honesty. "But Mrs. Delaney's been recording conversations since before you arrived. The poison was already in the well. You just helped expose it." That evening, Riley found Gideon in his study, staring at the wall where Mrs. Delaney's personnel photo had hung for over 2 decades. The frame sat empty now, leaving behind a pale rectangle that marked 23 years of misplaced trust. "I'm thinking about shutting it down," he said without preamble. "The household staff, the domestic operations. Moving to a smaller place, fewer people, less vulnerability." Riley felt something cold settle in her stomach. "What about the horses? What about them?" His voice was flat, emptied of the passion she'd seen when he talked about Obsidian. "Horses don't lie. Horses don't spend decades building trust just to sell you out for the right price. Maybe I should stick to animals." The defeat in his voice was more disturbing than any rage would have been. This was a man who had built an empire on his ability to read people, to inspire loyalty, to create systems of trust that functioned like clockwork. Mrs. Delaney's betrayal hadn't just exposed his organization. It had undermined his fundamental belief in his own judgment. "So that's it?" Riley asked, surprised by the anger in her own voice. "One betrayal and you abandon everything. Everyone who stayed loyal, everyone who's still here because they believe in something worth protecting." Gideon finally looked at her, and she saw something broken in his eyes. "What's left to protect, Riley? What's left that isn't already poisoned?" The question hung in the air between them like a challenge, demanding an answer she wasn't sure she could give. Riley found her answer in the pre-dawn darkness of the stable, where Obsidian stood in his paddock like a living shadow against the California sky. The stallion lifted his head at her approach, ears forward with recognition, rather than fear. In the weeks since Mrs. Delaney's arrest, he'd become the one constant in a world turned upside down, still wild, still powerful, but no longer fighting every human contact as if it were a battle for survival. "You're up early," Gideon's voice came from behind her, carrying the rough edge of too little sleep and too much whiskey. Riley didn't turn around. "I've been thinking about your question, about what's left that isn't poisoned." She heard his footsteps on the gravel, measured and careful. In the past week, he'd moved through his own house like a guest unsure of his welcome, questioning every interaction, doubting every gesture of loyalty from the remaining staff. And his voice held the weary skepticism of a man who'd stopped believing in clean answers. "This," Riley said, gesturing toward Obsidian, "he was sent here as a weapon, a living symbol of everything the Caldwells thought they could use to control you. But look at him now." The stallion approached the fence, lowering his magnificent head to accept Riley's touch with something approaching trust. Not submission. Obsidian would never submit, but partnership built on mutual respect. "You didn't break him," she continued, her voice steady with growing conviction. "You didn't try to dominate him or force him into compliance. You let him choose to trust, and that choice made all the difference." Gideon moved to stand beside her at the fence, his shoulder close enough to brush hers. "It's not the same thing, Riley. People aren't horses." "No," she agreed. "People are more complicated. They have reasons for their choices that go beyond fear and survival. Mrs. Delaney didn't betray you because you failed her. She betrayed you because Marcus Caldwell offered her something she wanted more than loyalty." 23 years, Gideon said, the words carrying the weight of accumulated pain. 23 years of what I thought was devotion, and it was all performance. Riley turned to face him fully, seeing the man beneath the armor of wealth and power, someone who'd built his empire on the fundamental human need to trust and be trusted, only to discover that his most basic assumptions were built on sand. "Then rebuild it differently," she said, her voice carrying new strength. "Not on blind loyalty or performed devotion, but on transparency, on choice, on partnerships where both parties know exactly what they're agreeing to." The morning light was strengthening now, painting the valley in shades of gold and green. Other horses moved in distant paddocks, the ranch awakening to another day despite the chaos that had shaken its foundations. "Is that what you're proposing?" Gideon asked, something shifting in his voice. "A partnership." "I'm proposing honesty," Riley replied. "Complete honesty. You know what I can do now. The systems architecture, the digital forensics, the ability to unravel conspiracies before they destroy you. And I know what you are. Not just the public image, but the man who values genuine trust enough to be devastated when it's betrayed." She moved closer to the fence, her hand still gentle on Obsidian's neck. "But if we're going to work together, it has to be as equals. No more secrets, no more tests, no more games where one of us holds all the cards. Real partnership means real power sharing." Gideon was quiet for a long moment, studying her profile in the growing light. "What are your terms?" he asked finally. "Full access to your security systems, input on all major personnel decisions, authority to implement new protocols without having to justify every choice." Riley's voice was calm but implacable. "And a place at the table when real decisions are made, not just when you need my specific skills." "And in return?" Riley smiled, the expression carrying both warmth and steel. "Complete transparency about my capabilities and my past, protection for the staff members who've remained loyal during this crisis, and a commitment to rebuilding this place as something stronger than it was before." She turned to face him fully, her hand still resting on Obsidian's powerful neck. "The choice is yours, Gideon, but I won't be invisible anymore. Those days are over." The stallion snorted softly, as if adding his own opinion to the negotiation. In the distance, Logan appeared on the main house's terrace, beginning his morning security rounds with military precision. Life continued, but the foundation was shifting beneath their feet. Gideon extended his hand across the space between them, not demanding submission, but offering partnership. "Deal," he said, his voice carrying the weight of new beginnings. The final move came disguised as a social event. 3 weeks after their partnership agreement, Riley stood in the main ballroom of the St. Francis Hotel, watching San Francisco's elite gather for what they believed was a charity auction for equestrian therapy programs. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over designer gowns and tailored tuxedos, while waiters moved through the crowd with champagne that cost more per bottle than most people's weekly salaries. But Riley wasn't there as decoration. She wore an elegant black dress that transformed her from invisible domestic worker into someone who belonged among the power brokers and influence peddlers. At her wrist, a delicate bracelet held a device that looked like jewelry but functioned as the most sophisticated surveillance equipment money could buy. "Target acquired," Logan's voice whispered through her nearly invisible earpiece. Marcus Caldwell just entered through the main entrance. "He's brought backup. 2 men, probably private security." Riley's pulse quickened, but her expression remained serenely composed. This evening had been carefully orchestrated, every detail planned to the second. The charity auction was real, but it served a dual purpose, drawing Marcus Caldwell out of hiding for the final confrontation. "Phase 2, Gideon's voice came through the comm system, calm and controlled. He stood across the ballroom near the auction podium, magnificent in his formal wear, playing his role as the generous philanthropist to perfection. Riley began moving through the crowd with purposeful grace, her path seemingly random but actually calculated to position her near the hotel's main computer terminal. The evening's auction items were being managed through a sophisticated digital system, one she'd spent weeks learning to manipulate with surgical precision. Marcus Caldwell found her exactly where she'd intended him to, near the display of equestrian photographs that included images of Obsidian in his current rehabilitated state. The man who had orchestrated months of psychological warfare looked older than his 35 years, his face bearing the stress of federal investigation and financial ruin. "Riley Morgan," he said, his voice carrying the particular venom of someone who'd lost everything and blamed others for his choices. "Or should I say, Riley Chen, your real name was surprisingly hard to uncover." "Marcus," she replied with cool politeness. "I wondered when you'd surface. Federal investigations must keep you busy." His smile was sharp as broken glass. "Not as busy as you might think. Amazing how quickly charges can be reduced when you have the right information to trade." The words sent ice through her veins. Marcus had always been skilled at survival, at finding ways to emerge from disasters with minimal damage to himself. "What information?" "Detailed records of your real capabilities, documentation of every system you've ever compromised, evidence of your involvement in activities that certain government agencies would find illuminating." His voice dropped to a whisper. "Turns out they're very interested in recruiting someone with your particular talents." Riley felt the trap closing around her. In exposing Marcus's crimes, she'd also exposed herself to scrutiny from agencies that operated in shadows deeper than anything Marcus could access. The choice was becoming clear: work for them or face prosecution for her past activities. "There's just one problem with your plan," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her system. "And what's that?" Riley smiled, the expression carrying none of her earlier politeness. "I recorded this entire conversation." She touched her bracelet and Marcus's voice echoed from speakers throughout the ballroom. "Amazing how quickly charges can be reduced when you have the right information to trade." The room fell silent as the recording continued, documenting Marcus's attempted blackmail in crystal clarity. Federal agents who'd been positioned as waiters and security guards moved with coordinated precision, surrounding Marcus before he could fully comprehend what had happened. "You see," Riley continued as handcuffs clicked into place, "some traps are meant to catch the hunter, not the prey." Gideon appeared at her side, his expression carrying satisfaction that bordered on predatory. "Attempting to blackmail a federal witness," he observed. "That's a new charge to add to your collection." As Marcus was led away, his protests echoing through the ballroom, Riley felt something shift inside her chest. Not relief, but completion. The man who'd controlled her life through fear was finally facing consequences that couldn't be bought, bargained, or manipulated away. The auction continued around them, the evening's facade maintained despite the drama that had just unfolded. But Riley knew that everything had changed in those few crucial minutes. She was finally truly free, 6 months later, Riley stood in the same paddock where everything had begun, watching Obsidian move with the fluid grace of an animal that had rediscovered trust. The morning mist clung to the valley floor, but the air carried warmth and the promise of clear skies. A perfect California dawn that seemed to mirror the transformation that had swept through the Hart estate. The ranch bustled with controlled activity. New staff members moved with purpose through their duties, but the atmosphere was different now. Gone was the oppressive weight of secrets and surveillance, replaced by something Riley had helped architect. Transparency tempered with respect, efficiency built on genuine collaboration rather than fear. "The quarterly security briefing is ready for your review," Logan announced, approaching with a tablet and the slight smile that had become his default expression since the new protocols were implemented. "All background checks completed, all systems updated, all personnel clearances current." Riley accepted the tablet, scrolling through reports that would have been unthinkable 6 months ago, comprehensive but not invasive, thorough without being paranoid. Every person who worked on the estate now knew exactly what was expected of them and exactly what protections they could count on in return. "Any concerns?" she asked, though the numbers told their own story. Staff turnover had dropped to almost zero. Productivity had increased across all departments. Most importantly, the sense of genuine teamwork that now characterized the estate's operations showed in every metric that mattered. "None," Logan replied, "although Thomas wants to discuss expanding the equestrian therapy program. We have a waiting list of veterans requesting placement." Riley nodded, making notes on the margin. The therapy program had been her suggestion, a way to put Obsidian's remarkable transformation to meaningful use while creating positive publicity that insulated them from future attacks. The Stallion's journey from traumatized weapon to healing partner had captured public imagination in ways that protected the entire operation. "Miss Chen?" A young voice interrupted her thoughts. Sarah, one of the new stable hands, approached with the mixture of confidence and respect that characterized the estate's new culture. "Obsidian is ready for the morning session, and Dr. Martinez wants to discuss the therapeutic protocols." Riley smiled at the sound of her real name spoken without fear or hidden agenda. The decision to stop hiding behind false identities had been liberating in ways she hadn't expected. Riley Chen, systems architect and equestrian therapy consultant, was a far more interesting person than Riley Morgan, invisible domestic worker, had ever been. "Tell him I'll be there in 10 minutes, she said, then turned back to Logan. "Is Gideon ready for the board presentation?" "Conference room reviewing the quarterly reports." Logan's expression carried a note of satisfaction. "The new partnership structure has exceeded all projected benchmarks. The board should be impressed." Riley made her way toward the main house, pausing at the memorial garden that now occupied the space where Mrs. Delaney's surveillance equipment had been discovered. The small plaza featured a fountain surrounded by benches, with a plaque that read, "In memory of trust broken and rebuilt." It served as both remembrance and reminder, acknowledgement of past betrayals and commitment to preventing future ones. In the conference room, Gideon stood before a wall of monitors, displaying charts, graphs, and financial projections that told the story of an organization reborn. He looked up as she entered, his expression carrying the warmth that had replaced his old calculating coldness. "Ready to change the world?" he asked, his tone carrying both affection and genuine respect. Riley moved to stand beside him at the presentation console, their shoulders touching in a gesture that had become natural over months of true partnership. On the screens before them, data streams showed an empire rebuilt on principles of transparency, mutual benefit, and shared power. Everything they'd fought to create together. "We already have," she said, her voice carrying quiet conviction. "One honest conversation at a time." Outside the conference room windows, Obsidian moved through his morning routine with a grace that spoke of choices freely made and trust freely given. The stallion that had arrived as a weapon had become a symbol of transformation, proof that even the most damaged beings could heal when offered respect instead of dominance, partnership instead of control. In the distance, the Pacific Ocean gleamed like hammered silver, and Riley Chen, no longer invisible, no longer afraid, no longer alone, prepared to face whatever challenges the day might bring with the confidence of someone who had finally found her place in the world. Thanks for watching today's story. Hope you enjoyed it. Subscribe to the channel for more, leave a like and tell us in the comments what you thought. See you in the next video.